Oren, we have a number of questions that I think are best summarized by this one, wondering how your analysis applies to, recognizing that you focused on manufacturing, and wondering how your analysis applies to knowledge or service workers.
Yeah, it's a great question because it certainly applies to the service sector as well. I think something unique has happened in manufacturing in the way that we sort of abandoned concern for it, even as if the rest of the world knew that it was important. And so we've seen a particular collapse there. I also think it's important to recognize the relationship between manufacturing and services, because when I describe that idea of kind of exporting need, that if you don't have actual what's called tradable goods or services, stuff the rest of the world wants, your economy can't really function. And I think, maybe the best illustration of this, it's funny, it was actually the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian, very pro-free trade think tank. They actually made a wonderful video illustrating a small town in Georgia that had been devastated by NAFTA. All of the textile manufacturing had left. And then it shows the resurgence when a Kia plant comes in 2010. And one of the people they profile is a young woman who's now working in the Kia plant, grew up herself into the poverty of the struggling time, now has a good job. That's great. But as importantly, they profile the owner of the pizza parlor in town. And there's this incredible clip of a whole table of Korean businessmen eating pizza at the pizza parlor. We can't all serve each other pizza. The health of the pizza parlor, the health of the barber shop depends ultimately on whether it is attached to an economy that is becoming much more productive in actually making things. So I do think there's something special about the actual physical productive economy. But I think ultimately all of this analysis applies to the service economy as well. Boosting productivity in services, and I think we have seen in recent years when you have real constraints on labor supply, when it is hard to find enough workers, you start to see a lot more efforts to bring in workers off the sidelines. You see pay go up. You see a greater emphasis on benefits. You see efforts to, for instance, to automate, right? I think we need an extraordinary amount of more technology introduced into service industries where we haven't seen nearly enough. And so I think the kind of, the globalization piece is less about services, but certainly if you're talking about the effects of immigration, it has been primarily in the service sector. If you're talking about financialization and the way that businesses operate, financial firms operate, you see it overwhelmingly in services. One very interesting phenomenon you're starting to see in private equity is what I would call moral arbitrage. You increasingly see them going and buying up veterinarian practices, nursing homes, campsites, youth sports. What do these things have in common? They are all areas where, frankly, these businesses are not being operated entirely for profit because you have other concerns probably if you're running one of them. And so the investment strategy of buying it up at the profit level it is being run and then ditching all the moral concerns and running it purely for profit, great way to make money, but not the kind of investment you want to see if you actually want to be improving those kinds of segments of the economy.
There's several questions on recent items in the news, and folks are also taking to your metaphor of the pie. So two-parter here. One person asks, does the one big beautiful bill change the size of the slices of the economic pie going forward? And a second person says, billionaires are eating bigger slices of the pie while some are just getting crumbs. Can you speak about our economic inequality?
Yeah, I think economic inequality is a huge problem. But I think it's probably not quite for the reason that our politics often focuses on it. One thing you notice, and I think it's probably a good thing, is that frustration about inequality is very rarely about the top 1%. Movements like Occupy Wall Street don't tend to get a lot of traction. And I think generally politicians find that when you sort of try to really activate anger at people who have been super successful and have the most, there isn't a whole lot of resentment from everybody else about that. They see it as just sort of unrelated to their lives. And I think to a significant extent they're right. Now, what sorts of things allow you to make that money? Big problem. But if people were earning massive amounts of money and becoming extremely rich, building great businesses and employing a lot of people, I don't think there would be a lot of concern. I would be a lot less concerned about that. What I worry about a lot more is essentially the pulling away of the upper middle class from the middle and the working class. That 20% that now kind of goes high school to college to career, you know, is able to get a six-figure job pretty quickly, to live where they want, to have a lot of flexibility in their life, to have a lot of disposable income. That separation out from people who have much less control over their own lives, have very little disposable income, is the one that I think does most of the damage. Because I think it is the haves in that sense that really dictate the shape of our society. When you look at why it has become so much harder to make ends meet, it's not because affording a 1970s standard of living has become harder. It's because we no longer accept a 1970s standard of living. The standard health insurance package, the standard starter home, the standard car, all of these things are now marketed to people with way more resources than the typical family actually has. And so that's a huge economic problem. With it comes all sorts of, I think, social and political problems. And so correcting for that, making it, and I didn't talk a lot in the sort of capitalism context, but from a policy perspective, our education system and how much we invest in that 20% that succeeds versus everybody else is exactly backward. Anything that we can do to make the typical job look a lot more like the successful job, that's, I think, where we need to really address our focus.
The other current news item that folks are asking for your thoughts on is tariffs, of course. First, I'll recognize that after Liberation Day, you were on just about every television screen that I could find. So what's your general commentary analysis of the proposed tariffs and how that has changed over the past few months? And then another question was asking about one of the stated goals of the Trump administration's tariff regime is onshoring what had been offshored, and wondering what kinds of goods the U.S. is capable of reindustrializing here, and how long will that take?
Yeah. So I really like tariffs. I think that tariffs as a sort of element of economic policy make an enormous amount of sense. And the reason for that goes back to that core idea that making things matters. If you think there is value to having a domestic manufacturing sector that is larger than what consumers think about when deciding what price to pay, then you cannot expect markets to take it into account. You cannot expect markets to deliver the level of manufacturing and sort of goods producing that you would want. And it is deeply compounded if you want to be in a global economy where others do care. And so that imbalance of saying, like, well, we're just going to have a free market, while other parts of the world say, no, we really care, we're going to try to attract manufacturing, leads to an allocation of resources that isn't efficient at all. So I think tariffs are an important part of addressing that. That being said, I don't think everything about the way that the Trump administration has been using tariffs necessarily makes sense. And I don't think it has been explained and developed as clearly as it needs to be. The way that I would think about it, and you can see this in what they're doing, is there are really three different kind of categories. One is what they'll call like the global tariff, which is like we're going to have 10% across the board, let's say. I think that's actually a very sensible policy. You have to raise your tax revenue from somewhere. If you told me we raise relatively more of it this way, putting a thumb on the scale for domestic production, and relatively less of it from other things, I think that's actually going to orient the economy in a positive direction. At the other extreme, you have the China situation. And China is kind of its own problem. I don't think you can actually have free trade or a free market with a communist authoritarian adversary. And by the way, no one else did either, right? Like not even Milton Friedman or Friedrich Hayek was like, we support free trade, let's have free trade with the Soviet Union. That was not a serious idea. The only reason we opened up to and embraced China, if you go back to the debates around 2000, was we believed they were liberalizing. We believed they were headed toward more of a market democracy, and we believed we could speed that along by embracing them. If you could go back to 2000 and tell people what the China of 2025 looks like, and say, hey, what do you think? Free trade with China. I think there'd be very few who would say, oh yeah, that's going to be great. And so on China, you see a difficult balancing act because we have gotten so entangled, because it is going to be very costly to disentangle. And I think the administration's policy there has been very unclear. But high tariffs targeting China, saying things can be made in many places, we just don't want them from China, I think makes a lot of sense too. In the middle is this whole kind of reciprocal tariffs thing. And that's where they don't really want tariffs, I think. They're trying to negotiate. They're trying to have other countries say, look, we've been running this very imbalanced model for a long time. Can we please get to a more balanced model? And that would be a whole separate hour-long discussion, but hopefully that is at least helpful in saying, like, parts of this I think make a lot of sense, parts make less. But it's really important to think about the specific problems and what the policy does in each case, rather than sort of say, well, free markets and efficiency are good, tariffs interfere with free markets and efficiency, therefore tariffs must be bad.
Our audience all week has wanted to ask most of our speakers, how concerned are you about the national debt?
I'm very concerned about the national debt for two reasons primarily. One is, I think, people have always talked about we are heading toward a crisis at some point. This is not sustainable. I think it's very important to say we are actually in that crisis now. We are at the point where the amount that we pay in interest on the existing debt is bigger than any other line item in the budget except Social Security. And so we're actually at the point where even if you wanted to do very responsible fiscal policy elsewhere, really get our house in order, the interest we're already committed to alone would be adding to the national debt, would be adding to the interest payment. So we are now in that kind of runaway cycle, even if still toward the beginning of it. But it is crowding out our capacity to do any of the other things anyone in either party would want to do. And that is a huge substantive problem and a huge political problem. The other reason I'm very concerned about it, and it connects back to this globalization point, is that we bear a lot of the responsibility for this trade deficit that we have, for what has happened in our economy. And having a government that's trying to borrow $2 trillion a year is what drives an awful lot of the rest of the world to loan us that money instead of buying stuff from us. There is no way to actually eliminate the trade deficit and get back to sort of producing as much as we consume if we are running a $2 trillion budget deficit. And anything that we do that expands that just makes our life hard. The one very encouraging thing I'll say is I actually think this is a very solvable problem. There's this this is a flaw in democracy and people will never vote for responsible fiscal policy. That's actually not true. We got to the year 2000, 220 years into this grand experiment with a budget surplus and debt below a third of GDP. It is only in this recent era where the two political parties have kind of both gone crazy in their respective directions on it that things have gotten out of control. And frankly, I don't think it's very politically popular. We do a lot of polling and find that the overwhelming majority of people on both ends of the political spectrum are way more reasonable about this than the politicians are. And I think there's a huge space. That's all of, yes, that's right. There's a huge space for political figures to actually say, we want to be serious about this and we are going to ask things from everybody, basically. But that is obviously not the politics we have right now.
I like this as our closing question as we are close to time. This person recognizes that you identify as a conservative economist and wonders how you would characterize a liberal economist would think about the issues you raised about what is broken. Is there a difference in identifying the problems, or is the difference in the solution?
It's a great question, and I think the difference is much more on the solutions. Sometimes some people say, like, hey, like the things you're saying sound like something Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders would say. Like, why aren't you a Democrat? Like, I'm already not an economist. Now I'm not a conservative either. We're really getting in trouble. I actually think it is incredibly healthy to have a lot more agreement on diagnosis. The description of what is happening doesn't need to be partisan. And I would cast more blame on my side, on the right of center, for really refusing to talk about a lot of these things for fear that if you acknowledge there's a problem, well then I guess you're going to have to accept the big government solution, which is not a very responsible way of thinking about it, isn't true, and actually makes things worse because then you just lose the election to the people who are talking about it and doing that stuff anyway. And so I think there's actually an increasing amount of agreement across the political spectrum on a lot of these problems. But I do think that leads in very different directions on solutions. And I think you still, what is changing, and you see it in the so-called realignment in our politics, is that right-of-center economics has been very libertarian. It has been Hayek and Friedman. That famous essay I mentioned from Hayek, though, is a great callback. It's called Why I Am Not a Conservative. The hyper-free market approach is not actually, I think, very conservative. And so I think where we are ending up with is three very different visions of what we should do about this. We have a very libertarian, no, just go even more free market. Markets will solve this. It's the best we can do. You have a very left-of-center view that is both more skeptical of markets and just more optimistic about what government can do. And then in between, you're increasingly seeing where I think the right-of-center is heading toward, that is more a kind of reclaiming of a conservative impulse that says, no, we really want our society ordered around markets, free choice, limited government. But as conservatives, we also recognize that, like, constraints tend to be good, that institutions are incredibly important, and that instead of just taking for granted that this will work, we actually do need a very affirmative and assertive policy agenda. And there are going to be places where that does agree with Democrats. That's great. Nothing wrong with agreement, but there are also a lot of ways where I think they then still tend to go in very different directions.
I'll remind our audience that Oren will be signing books at 1:30 p.m. today at the Author's Alcove next to the bookstore, where books will be available for purchase. Chautauqua, will you please help me thank Oren Cass?
Thank you very much. This was so much fun. I appreciate it.